This is Talking Rackheads. This is the Phrase Seek 16, otherwise known as the PS16. And today's Talking Rackhead episode is going to be mainly focused just on this one module. Now, why? Well, there's a bit of background to this. For those that know me, you'll all know that I am sequencer nut, I suppose is the best way of describing it. I love sequencers. Over the years, I've owned, sold, blown up all different manner of sequencers. Everything from a custom-built 8-step sequencer to go with my Mini-Moog, right through to Eurorack modules such as Metropolis or the Rene, or even a Times Arrow, software sequencers, one of my favourite of course being numerology, right through to modern day hardware sequencers like the Squark Pyramid, and of course the mighty Circlon, and which is an incredible sequencer, but of course costs a lot of money. And so when I was browsing through the Facebook group, I saw a photograph that Mark Boulay posted up. Mark's the developer at Impromptu Modular of the PS16, and I looked at it and thought, wow, this looks like the Stepper Acid, a module for Eurorack, and one of my favourite Eurorack sequencers. And it had that feel to it when I looked at it. And when I looked at the specification, it confirmed to me that this was apparently based upon a large amount of influence from the Stepper Acid. And indeed, Mark confirmed this, that was the sequencer that sort of generated the ideas behind the PS16. And so I started to play with it. And oh my goodness me, it's a great little sequencer. The thing about it is that it's got all these capabilities and facilities that are available in some sequencers that are available at VCV Rack, but not all of them are in one module. And in the case of the PS16, it had most of them already implemented, and the possibility of others being implemented later. So me being me, I contacted Mark and started bombarding him with all these extra little features I thought the PS16 should have. And Mark, being Mark, a very generous and patient guy, listened to all the comments I had about what I thought the PS16 could do with extra features, functionality. And lo and behold, he started to implement some of them. And I was like, wow, this is really turning the PS16 into my sequencer of choice in VCV Rack. So that's the background as to why I've decided to do a special edition of Talking Rackhead almost entirely focused on the PS16, because this is a sequencer that I've been waiting for to appear in VCV Rack from day one, and now it's here. So I'm going to go through this sequencer and take a really slow, in-depth look at all its features and techniques you can use it for, and hopefully transfer some of that to all you out there, so you'll know as well as I do just how good the PS16 truly is. I'm not going to go through each feature step by step, basically because There's so many of them and you'll probably get bored to death before you even start using it. So what I've decided to do instead is just do a series of short videos about each feature as I come across them, showing you how I use them, how they can be used to create different functions within VCV Rack, and just give you a really good in-depth overview of everything this sequencer is capable of. So first of all, let's start with what it is. And what it is fundamentally a 16-step sequencer. There basically is per pattern 16 steps, and you can select anything up to 16 steps. So you can have 1 step, 5 steps, 12 steps, 16 steps. And then you've got 16 patterns, which consist of one sequence per pattern, and those can be sequenced. So in essence, really the PS16 is an up to 256 step sequencer. And when I say up to, I literally mean everything from 1 to 256 steps. You get to choose just how many steps you want the sequence to be, and this will allow you to do it. So that alone gives it a great amount of flexibility. Now, the next thing is it's a single voice sequencer. So it only plays one track all the way through. So one track, one voice. It has, however, 2 gates. So for every step, you have a choice of gate 1 or gate 2 or both gates. And I'll explain to you why that's very useful later. But just know that most sequencers only have 1 gate per step if they have a gate at all. And some don't, which is very frustrating. But this has got the ability to program 1 of 2 gates or both gates together per step. The next part of this is that the sequencer itself will follow whatever clock you feed it. So it doesn't have to follow a regular clock. You can feed it irregular clocks as well for rhythmic changes whilst the sequence is moving along. So again, that's another useful function and very important to the way that the PS16 can be used. The next part of this is that it's got its own built-in keyboard entry system. And what that means is that you can enter notes for the sequencer per step from just clicking on one of these keys and selecting one of the octaves here for those notes. And you can do it on the fly. That means that you can choose notes whilst the sequence is playing and enter them. And you can do that in 2 ways. You can click on a note whilst the sequence is playing, which allows you to quickly insert a note as the sequence is going round. But sometimes that's a little tricky because you're not quite sure if you've got it perfectly timed with your click. Or there is this little button over here called attach. And when the sequence is running, you can turn this off, choose the step that you want to enter the data for, and then click on the note for that particular step whilst the sequencer is still running through. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that now. So I'm just going to start the sequence running, and I'm just using one sequence of 16 notes. So there are 16 steps all playing the same note. Now I'm going to turn off the attach function. See, it's on at the moment because there's a red light here. So I just turn it off, and this red light shows me which step I'm going to edit. and I move that around using the left and right arrow buttons. So I've chosen step 5. Now I'll choose a different octave for step 5, and when it plays that note, it'll be an octave higher, just like that. Move forward, and I'm going to choose a different note for this step. Now a different note for that one. Now a different note for this one. So you can actually create and modify patterns on the fly as they're playing. And that could be quite useful, not only when you're creating sequences, but also when you're playing them back in real time. You can change individual steps without stopping the sequence and getting exactly the step you want with exactly the note you want at that moment in time the next time it loops round. And again, I'm just going to do that for a couple of minutes so you can see how it works. So there you go. I was just changing each individual note using the arrows and this to tell me which step I'm changing, and just clicking on the octave and the note I want to select in the sequence to change on the next loop. Now, it's also worth noting that this sequencer, when you're using the keyboard, is quantized to semitones. So you don't need a pitch quantizer coming out of this. It is already quantized per note as you're cycling around. So you don't need to use external quantization. You can still do so by just taking an output here and feeding it to a quantizer, like a scale quantizer, for example, and use that to quantize notes to a specific scale. But I actually feel the PS16 is much better doing it this way and you working out the scales for yourself as you're going through it. And that works really well. It's also worth noting that the input doesn't have to be from this keyboard. You've also got a CV input here that you can input voltages, pitches, etc. from another source for each step. So you can create non-quantized sequences if you want to, just by feeding it different voltages. So it's not locked to quantizing, but when you use the built-in keyboard, or as I'll show you later, an external keyboard, then they are quantized to semitones. Now let's take a look at another way of entering notes. You can use the PS16 not only via its built-in keyboard, but via an external keyboard like a MIDI keyboard or even a software keyboard. And in this instance, I'm going to use a software keyboard. In fact, I'm going to use the 12 key, which is another module by Impromptu Modular. And this allows you to input from a separate keyboard into the PS16. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, first of all, if you notice, the keys are a little bit bigger, which is a little easier to see. But that's not the main reason for doing it. This is the reason why. If you right-click on the 12 key and choose duplicate, like this, we'll get a second keyboard come up. And if we keep doing this up to as many keyboards as we want, I've now got a 4-octave keyboard to use. And if I wire it up using these outputs and inputs like this, take a CV out to a CV in, gate out to gate in, octave +1 to octave in, and do this for each of the modules that I want to connect. If you notice, when I set the octave here, you see for this lowest one, all the others go up by 1 step. So what I end up with is a complete 4-octave keyboard to play with when entering notes on the PS16. So to connect the 12 key to the PS16, you take the last CV out and connect it to the CV in, just here. Then you take the last gate and connect that to the right input here. Now, making sure that auto step is on, so the switch is up here pointing towards auto step. What this means is every time I play a note on the 12 key, the sequencer will take 1 step forward. So I don't have to keep clicking on the forward and back button. I can just play a stream of notes and they will fill the sequence as I go along, like this. So I've now entered 16 notes for the 16-note sequence. And if I play run, they'll play back. A really fast and quick way of entering notes in the sequencer. And again, you don't have to use the 12 key. You can use an external MIDI keyboard through the MIDI to CV interface module. And again, take the gate from that module to the right and take the octave, the volt per octave output and feed it to the CV in. And when you press a note on your MIDI keyboard, this will take 1 step forward and record the note in the step of a sequence. Makes it really, really simple and easy to use for quick data entry. So that's how I use the 12 key software keyboard to quickly enter a sequence of notes. Now, I'm going to initialize the PS16. So now everything's back to defaults. And I'm going to quickly show you how you change the length of a sequence. And all you do is press the length button and these dots will change to yellow like this. Or green, I'm sorry. And they only stay green for a short period of time. While they're green, if you start clicking on the left and right buttons, that will shorten the sequence length like this. So that's now an 8-step sequence. If I press the length button, I can check it. Yep, 8 steps. So now this particular sequence, which is sequence number 1, will play for 8 steps and then go back like this. And I can change the length whilst the sequence is playing. So say I want this to be a 6-note sequence, I just click on length and reduce the steps. And now it's a 6-step sequence. And if I want it to be a 9-step, I click on length and extend it. Back to 8, I just press length, click on the arrow, and now it's an 8-step sequence. And when you're performing, that's a really, really clever little trick to fill up all 16 steps with notes, but then change the length of a sequence in mid-song so you get a different feel from it. And of course, with multiple sequences running, then you can have multiple sequences of different lengths, giving you those interesting polyrhythmic, constantly evolving sequences playing all the time. Now, we've looked at how to enter sequences using the inbuilt keyboard or an external keyboard or a software keyboard, and we've looked at how to change the step length of a keyboard. Now what I want to do is show you how you can change the mode for the way the steps are played in sequence per sequence. So this is what the mode button does over here. When you press this, the display changes here to the type of playback mode that the sequence will be played back in. So I'm going to turn the volume up and let you hear what the standard sequence sounds like. So there we have just a standard rising scale going step 1 to step 8 and then back again. And I press the mode button and that shows me that we're in forward motion. That is, play the sequence in order, starting at step 1 forward to the end and then repeat. Now if I change by turning this knob to the next mode, now we're in reverse mode and the same sequence is being played but in reverse order. Now the next mode is called PPG or ping pong mode, and what that does is it plays it forward and then plays it reverse and then plays it forward and plays it reverse. Now the next mode is called Brownian, and Brownian is a strange mode. And I'm just going to turn the volume off for a second so you can hear me. So what Brownian does, Brownian is this sort of like random step sequence, but it's not fully random. Brownian is also called the drunken walk. And it's called the drunken walk because what it does is emulate how someone who is slightly drunk walks down the road. And what I mean by that is, when a person who's slightly drunk, or actually quite drunk, walks, what they tend to do is take a step forward, then they might take a step back, then they might take 2 steps forward, and then 1 step back. And then they'll sort of stand still for a little while and get their balance, and then they'll start walking forward again. And they'll take a couple of steps forward, and then they lose their balance and take one step back. So that's what Brownian does. It lets the sequence move in a general pattern next to each other. So if you watch these little lights here, you can see it goes forward sometimes, stops every so often, then we'll go back a few steps, and then we'll go forward a few steps. And this gives you this sort of effect. So that's Brownian, and then the last mode is fully random, where notes from the sequence are played in a completely random order. And notice how that is different from Brownian in the sense that the notes can be any note. They don't have to be next to each other when it plays the next note. If I go back to Brownian, you see how the notes are always next to each other if it changes pitch. It doesn't suddenly jump from, say, step 6 to step 2. It has to go through 5, 4 and 3 to get there. So those are the modes for each sequence, and you program the mode for each sequence. And these have all sorts of uses. Sometimes you can reuse the same sequence in a different patch, and then in a different song, and then just have it playing forward sometimes and have it playing reverse the others. Or the random one's quite interesting, because if you program several notes the same, and then a couple of notes that are different, and then several notes the same and a couple of notes are different, the randomness of it will mean that it will play more often than not the notes that are the same, but every so often pick out one that's different. So it sort of feels like the same sequence is playing over and over again, but every so often a different note will sound. And that gives you this sort of evolving sequencer pattern. And I'm going to demonstrate that later. Now, for this final part of the first half of this in-depth look at the PS16, I'm going to take a look at the buttons below here and what they all do. And these are what make this sequencer really special. So the first one I'm going to look at is the slide button. Here's a sequencer running, an 8-step sequence. So that's a standard 8-step sequence. And what slide does is allows you to add portamento per step for any note in the sequence. And this is what gives you that sort of 303 effect that you can use quite easily. So in this case, I'm going to turn on the slide for step number 3. See, just press the button here. And then I'm going to set it for step number 7 as well. Sorry, 6. And the amount of slide is selected here. It's anything from 0 to 2 seconds. And depending on the speed of your piece, the tempo, this is how you configure how long the slide takes from one note to the next. So I've set this up, and now I'm just going to let the sequence play, and you'll hear the slides take effect. Here's the slide on step 3, and I've got attach off so I can move using these things to the step I want to modify, and I'll turn the slide off so you can hear the change. So that's slide off. and that's slide on for that step. So that's the slide button. Now the next thing I want to look at are the gates. Now remember, there are 2 gates per note, and I'm currently just using one of those 2 gates, gate number 1, to trigger the envelope for my filter. So if I turn off the gate for a step, the envelope will not trigger, and you'll just hear the envelope as it still is whatever position it's in when it hits that note. So I'm going to again set the sequence running, and then I'll turn off some of the gates for some of the notes. You'll hear the difference it makes. So I'm going to turn off the gate for the second step. Now I'll turn it on again. Now I'll turn off the gate for the 4th step. And the 3rd and the 7th step. So that's the gate button. It's a per step gate. And again, you've got 2 of them, so you can actually use 2 different patterns of gates here if you wanted to for each sequence. And I'm going to show you after the break how I use 2 gates to create very interesting effects using 2 sounds. But for now, let's just stick to 1 gate. Now, if you listen very carefully, when you turn off a gate, you still get the next note sounding, but it's just not triggered, and you get this sort of what we call a legato effect, where you can hear the next note play but without the opening of the trigger. So it's sort of like a duller sound, but it's still in the background. If you listen very carefully, you'll hear that happening. And so that's how you create legatos when you turn off the gates. But say you don't want that to happen. What you want is the note to remain the same pitch without changing when it moves to the next step. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to extend the attack a little and move the sustain up a bit. And I'm going to play that sequence again, so hopefully you can hear those legato notes clearer. And I'm going to turn off the slides so you can hear it even better. So you can hear those notes playing even though there's no gate. You can still hear the sound of it without the gate playing. And again, that's great if you want a legato effect. But say you don't want that to happen. Say you want it to keep the same pitch for longer than 1 note. Well, that's where the tie step comes in. So to show you that working, I'm going to step through the pattern. So that's the last note before the next note plays, where there's no gate. You see that? No gate. But that note we can still hear being played when the sequence is running. So to stop that from happening, you choose the last note you want to hold across and you press the tie step button. Okay? And what that will do is tie the note across. If you notice, it's turned off the gate, but it has also kept the pitch the same. So it's made two changes. It's turned off the gate and it's remembered what the last pitch was being played and kept that. So now you get this effect. Which is a much more musical sounding effect when you don't want legato, especially for long sounding notes. And again, if I make the delay even longer, you'll hear it even better. Now if you hear when it gets here, this one has not been tied, so we're getting that legato effect. So say I want that one to be held rather than play a new note, then all I do is put it on the note I want and press the tie step. So tie step is what you use to create longer sounding notes within a sequence. So even though I'm running at sort of 8 steps in the sequence, I can actually have a sequence playing long notes. And I'm going to quickly put one together to show you what I mean. So let me go here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly create a sequence of 16 notes. So I'm going to expand that out to 16. Okay, now what I'm going to do is play the same note for 4 notes and then a different note, a different note and a different note, each being 4 steps. So. Okay, so now I've created a 16-step pattern playing 4 different notes. And in normal mode, this is what you will hear. Which is the notes re-triggering each time. So to stop that from happening, I'll choose the second note and press tie. And the third note, press tie. Fourth note, press tie. Now I'll do the same for the 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th steps. And the same for the 10th, 11th and 12th steps. And then the 14th, 15th and 16th steps. So now when I play the sequence, it should play 4 long notes, each of 4 steps each, like this. And this tie step functionality is something that a lot of sequencers don't have. You can sort of fake it a little bit by setting things up manually, but it takes a lot of programming, and often you get these weird pitch glitches if you don't do it, which can sound unmusical when they're not intended. So tie stepping lets you get round that in a very quick and simple way, because in essence what tie step is a macro. It's doing 2 jobs. It's repeating the previous pitch and turning the gate off for it, which gives you that continuity, those longer sounds without glitching. Okay, so that's tie step, and we've covered slide. So the last thing here is the gate probability. Now, This is a very special function. I've not found this on any sequencer in VCV rack yet. I've seen probability like in the quad sequencer from Apelsen's, but that probability is across the entire sequence, not per step. And per step makes a whole different world. So let me show you how you use that. I'm going to create a simple 8-step sequence. So first thing I'm going to do is initialize the sequencer and then set the length to 8 steps. So here we have 8 steps. And I'm going to create a quick sequence like this. Right, so this is what the sequence sounds like. Okay, now what I'm going to do is change the probability for the second, fourth, sixth and seventh steps. And what that will do is sometimes when it loops through it will play them and sometimes it won't. The greater the value programmed here, the more likely it is to play the note. The lower this value is, the less likely it is to play that note. So I'm going to turn the probability on for those steps I was talking about. So the first step I want to always play, so I leave the probability alone. The second step I'm going to turn on probability. The third step I want it to always play that step. The fourth step I'll turn on probability. The fifth step I want it to always play. The sixth step I'll turn on probability. The seventh step I will turn on probability, and the eighth step I'll turn on probability. Now, because probability is currently set to the maximum of 1, when I play the sequence, all the notes will still play. Now, as I turn down the probability, some of the notes will stop playing every time. And what this lets you do is create randomness to a predictable pattern. So you can determine some notes that will always play and some notes that will only play now and again. And this is a really interesting way of making an evolving pattern where you program in certain notes and let them play just now and again, and the rest of the sequence plays as written. So if you are sort of like sneaky and program a sequence in that uses every other note, for example, that's great. But then you can program these in between notes and give them a random value, here a probability, and they'll only play now and again. And of course that was in sequence. But if I turn on the mode to random mode, now what happens is randomly it will always play each of the notes, but sometimes when it hits a note where there's a probability where it's not to play, you'll get rhythmic randomness as well as pitch randomness, like this. And by turning up a delay on this, you get some very interesting effects. And I've just changed the filter setting a bit. And again, if I turn off the attach, I can determine which ones are probable and not. And I'm going to turn off the probability for this note. And I'll make the rest of the notes have a more likely probability of playing. And that's a pretty cool effect. I actually like that. You can do all sorts of things with that effect. And in fact, later on in the big mega patch, what I did was use that effect to play a snare part where definitely it would always play on the 5th beat, but at the end of a sequence, the last 4 beats I set to probabilities, so the snare sound would do these random fills at the end of every 2 bars. And you never knew what they were going to be. Sometimes it would play all 4, sometimes it would play the 1st and the 3rd, sometimes it would play the 1st, the 3rd and the 4th, sometimes it would play the 2nd and 3rd and the 4th. And every time it looped round, it was always something different. So it gives the feel of a drummer playing random drum fills at the end of each sequence. And again, you can use that for musical notes. You can use this for gates to program the gates. So I use gates for programming drums with this. And again, I'll cover that in another video a bit later on. But that's how all this works. And this random probability on a per step basis is a big deal, because you can determine which steps will always play and which steps might play or might not play, giving a very interesting, random but controllable feel to a piece. So we've covered the sequence itself, we've covered how to enter notes, we've covered the gates, the slide, the tie step, we've covered random gates and probability, and we've also covered how to enter notes using the internal keyboard or the external keyboard. After the break, the next thing we're going to look at is how to assemble sequences in patterns into songs, and how that is how you can create some really good, lengthy and interesting sequence patterns. Okay, so time for an intermission.
Well, hello folks, and welcome to 10-Minute Modular. On today's 10-Minute Modular, we're going to talk about one of the physically largest modules in our rack, and that is the Modal synthesizer by Audible Instruments, which in the real world is Elements by Mutable Instruments. This is an amazing module. It's huge. It has a lot. Can I get through it in 10 minutes? Let's find out. Ready? Start the clock, and let's go. Okay, so I have the modal synthesizer here, which is Elements, next to the resonator, which in the real world is Rings. And I'm doing this on purpose because these two modules are very, very similar. The right-hand side of this module, is essentially the same as resonator. Essentially. I mean, okay, so we have frequency, which are coarse and fine, and our structure, which is similar to geometry. Now here, damping, brightness, position. We have damping, brightness, position. very, very similar to the resonator. Space is an additional reverb knob, which is pretty cool. So what I'm going to do is I've initialized this, put it on the original mode. We'll talk about the chord mode a little bit later. And I'm going to run a sequence. So let's quickly go through the right side. There, you can see how space is just a reverb. Position, much like the position knob here, of where on the object are we striking it. And that's kind of the key to this module. Where are we striking it? How are we exciting? You see, whereas here we had a strum that basically just said, hey, pluck a note, start a note of some kind, depending on how we're going to set up these buttons up here. This one is, we're going to resonate it, but the way we strike it, the way we excite the note is going to change based on the left side. Now, right now I'm using the strike mode. And here if I turn it down, that's essentially volume. How hard am I striking it? The timbre definitely relates to how it sounds. Although, you remember, we kind of did that with geometry and position on the resonator. And sure enough, we can change it here, and we can change the geometry, as well as the brightness. So between brightness, geometry, position, damping, and timbre, we can get a lot of really amazing sounds. And that brings us to the mallet knob. The mallet knob and the flow knob, as we'll see a little bit later, is not what you expect. It's not a consistent go from one to the other. What it is a whole bunch of steps. And as we step through, you'll hear that we're actually striking this imaginary object in a different way. Hear how we're almost like bowing a piece of metal. And as I move up, you'll hear different types of excitements. There's a more striking sound. That has a little addition of noise to it. That's interesting. Well, that's quite clean. Okay, now we have a flam. Now we have basically two mallets going blup, 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 blup. Let's see what happens if we keep going. That flam gets a little wider. And here in the end, it's almost like dropping a pebble on a drum head where you get bounces. Now that's strike. I'm going to turn strike down. I'm going to pass exactly the same sequence into blow. And as you might imagine, this is the sound of, you would think, a wind instrument, but it's actually more like blowing across the top of a beer bottle. And our timbre also adjusts the sound of that. And of course, anything on this side can be affected by the resonance on the right side. So we have a kind of interesting blowing sound. It really sounds, don't expect it to be like a flute. I really think of more panpipes or blowing across a beer bottle, that kind of interesting sound. And guess what? The flow, much like mallet, is not a consistent A to B cycle. It's a bunch of steps. So let's hear what those steps sound like. See, different tones of wind, different amounts of wind. And by the way, we can mix this. Now, there is a subtle hint here, and that's this dotted line, that this contour has to do with the bow and the blow excitement voices, but not the mallet. What is that? Well, the contour is basically like a built-in ADSR. So let's see what the contour does. See, that is like changing the damping. Basically expanded the gate, didn't it? So this is a very short, it's like having the attack on an ADSR very fast and the release very fast. So we can really control the structure, the attack of this sound using that. Now we've done blow, we've done strike. Let's go to bow. And of course, bow, we're going to assume is going to sound like a violin or something bowed. It's more like, think of a resonant piece of steel or wood or something and using a violin bow on that. It's a subtle effect, but you can tell it's different from blow. Okay, one of the things I like to do is use the bow or blow or even strike input of elements or sound of elements. But I'm going to hook it up to MIDI. I'm going to use my CV as volts per octave and my gate for my gate. And what I'm going to do is I have a little voice here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this voice. Yeah, kind of interesting. And now if I bring the contour down, so I'm only getting the blow, these sharp attacks. It's a really interesting way to layer it. So let's do something a little different. Let's take the even VCO and go to a sine wave. I'm going to try to add a little bit of the blow sound. And using this to layer sounds on top of another sound is really a very cool voicing. So let me put it back to the sequencer because I want to show you a cool additional feature that this synthesizer module has. We right click, we have a chord mode. So check this out. Let's go into regular mode. And you know what? I'm going to add a little of the mallet strike. And now we're going to switch it from original mode into chord mode and check out what happens. How cool is this? And now let's start playing with the mallet and flow. Wow, that almost sounds like a staccato string section. Let's release the damping, maybe change the contour. And add some space. Well, folks, I hope that gives you a little bit of insight as to what could be done with the Modal synthesizer or elements. There is a lot of sounds in here. Every little tweak of every little knob seems to go in a completely new direction. So enjoy that, practice that, play with that, and as always, stay curious. Okay, Nigel, back to you, buddy.
And that was another great episode from Greg. Thanks, mate. Really good. Okay, so back to the PS16. And in this particular part, I want to take a look at some of the other functions of the PS16 that I haven't covered so far. So first of all, we have a sequence number input. And what this allows you to do is use a voltage to change the sequence number manually. So for example, you could set up a series of buttons or for example Mark 1 triggers from AS with set voltages, so you can press a button and pre-select a specific sequence. You've also got an input for the mode button, so you can press this and then choose which of the playback modes you want via a voltage, or could be an LFO, could be whatever you want to send that outputs voltages to either of these CVs. So that's pretty cool. You've also got a left and right cursor input, which again, you could set up buttons for, so you don't have to have the phrase sequence 16 close to whatever else you're controlling. If you've set up a series of Mark 1 buttons like I do and Mark 2 triggers to control a mix, you could set up 2 buttons over there to go backwards and forwards through the sequence, which can also be very useful. So again, these are voltage inputs that you would send a trigger to in this case. Other than that, the next mode that I want to show you is the use of twin gates. Now, what I've done here is I've created a sequence and I've set up different gates on both. So, for example, in this sequence, gate 2 is triggered on every single part of the step of the sequence, whereas gate 1 I've set up to only trigger for certain on certain steps. So like if you watch down here, on step 1, gate 1 will definitely trigger on step 1. On step 2, gate 1 will trigger, but with a probability, so sometimes it will and sometimes it won't. Gate 3, exactly the same. Sometimes it will trigger, sometimes it won't. Gate 4 is the same. Gate 5 will always trigger. Gate 6 sometimes, gate 7 sometimes, gate 8 sometimes, gate 9 always will trigger. So this gives the effect of I can be absolutely certain that I'll get a trigger on gates on the steps 1, 5, 9 and 13, but all the rest will have a random element to them. And then what I've done is I've taken the output for gate 1 to the envelope of my first voice, which in this case is an even VCO. Gate 2, on the other hand, is on every trigger on every step. So that will always play every step. And I've taken the gate from that and fed that to the trigger input of a Cornrows X in the full synth voice mode. So to show you what this means, I'm going to play you the Cornrows X voice just by itself, and then I'll add in the voice from the even VCO. And what you'll hear is Cornrows X playing all the time and the even VCO playing some of the time, almost like an emphasis on certain parts. So that gives a really different way of handling things. And of course, you could use that for accents, for example. You could use that for two voices playing the same sequence, but for example, you could alternate. So the first voice could play the first step and the second voice play the second step, and then the first voice play the third and the second voice play the fourth. Or you could have the first voice play the first 8 notes and the second voice play the second 8 notes. Or you could have the first voice play the first 4, the second voice play the second 4, and then both voices play the last 8. It gives you such a different way of putting together textures using voices. And these voices that you use could be similar, or they could be one louder and softer, or you could have one with an open or closed filter, or they could be two entirely different voices like I just demonstrated. So now I want to show you how you do basic editing using the copy and paste. So here I've created a sequence in step number 1, in slot number 1, and it sounds like this. It's just a simple 12-step sequence. So now I want to copy that and paste it into a new sequence. So I press the copy button and you'll see that the 5 lights here, the black notes, light up to let you know you've copied. Then I move to the sequence I want to copy it to, sequence number 2, and I press paste. And the white note lights will light up to let you know that you've pasted. Now if I press run, the same sequence will play in sequence slot number 2. Now I'm going to turn off the attach button and change a couple of the notes. So now I can switch back to sequence 1, which is the original sequence. And now I've got sequence 2, which is slightly modified. And that's it. That's as easy as it is to copy and paste between sequences. You just choose your sequence, press copy, and you'll see the lights on the black notes here light up. Move to the sequence you want to copy them to, let's say sequence number 12. Press paste, and now sequence number 12 contains your copied pattern. That's simple. Really easy, copies all the information you want, makes life really simple. Okay, so now we've moved on to a more complex patch. In this patch I'm using, as you can see, 5 different PS16s. And each PS16 is driving at least one cornrows X. And so I'm going to show you why I've used 5 and how I put these together. And the first one I'm going to start with is the one in the bottom right hand corner down here. Now this is playing at the moment a straightforward, what I call medium paced synth line that sounds something like this. So just a straightforward, very simple synth line. And what I'm going to do is put this into full random mode. So it's going to play notes from this sequence entirely at random, like this. Okay, and now I'm going to add some reverb and some delay to that to thicken it out. So that's the first voice. The second voice is a much faster, in fact double the speed part of the first one, which sounds like this. And again, I'm going to put it in full random mode. So now we've got two parts, when I play them together, are completely at random from the notes I've chosen. So they're like the moving sequencer parts. And then these other three sequencers I'm using to play chords. And what I've done is I've set up a 16-note chord sequence. Typically the root of the chord is on this sequence, the third note in the chord is here, and the fifth or seventh notes are here. And I'm using two corn rows, one octave below the other, to emphasize the bass part along with the root, and then these two just single voices, and when they play together they sound like this. So that's a chord sequence. Now we'll put the whole lot together and you'll see what this is capable of doing. And again, because these two are random, you're getting a random sort of semi-melodic part on top of a straightforward chord sequence, which is, gives a nice textural change to things, but also, again, it's constantly changing all the time. So, again, very simple to set up. All I did to set the chords up was just play each note of the root of the chord, and I did it in the attach mode off, so I could just play each note individually and then just build the chord up, then go to the next step, build the second chord up, go to the third step, build the third chord up, and just played each note so I could hear how each one sounded together. And that created my 16-step chord sequence. And of course, as I'll show you later, you could have 16 of these 16-note chord sequences. So 16-step chord sequences, giving you the possibility of doing a 256 separate chord progressions in one track, which is incredible. So that's the basic functionality of the PS16 in single sequence mode. Now what we're going to take a look at in the next video is the song mode, where we combine all these ideas together. So now we get into song mode. So what I've done here is I've created 16 different 16-step sequences. So I've got 16 sequences. Each one is slightly different to the one before it. And I've done that for a reason, as part of a demonstration of something a little later. But for now, I'm just going to let you listen to what sequence 1 sounds like. So that's sequence number 1. And by rotating the knob here, I can change to sequence number 2. So that's sequence number 2. And rotate again to sequence number 3. And again rotate to sequence number 4. And as I said, I've created 16 of these sequences. Now, to enter song mode, I'm just going to stop the sequence from running here, and you turn this switch from sequence to song. And here we now are in song mode. And so what this means is that sequence number 1 here is going to play first in the first step of the song. And now I use the left and right arrow keys to go to pattern 2 of the song, like this, and I've changed that pattern from sequence from 1 to 2. So the second pattern it will play will be sequence number 2. And again, for the third step, I've done sequence number 3. For the fourth, sequence number 4. For the fifth, sequence number 5, and so on. Now, of course, you don't have to do them in order. You could do, for step 1, you could have sequence 1. For step 2, sequence 2. For step 3, sequence 1 again. For step 4, sequence 3. And you can build up entire structures for different songs in different keys or whatever else as you go through your 16 possible pattern slots. But the reason I've done it like this is because, as I said, I've set up these patterns so that each one is slightly different to the one before it. So it sort of gives a build-up function to it. So I'm just going to play the song from start to finish, one loop round, so you'll hear how it works. And here you'll see the sequence moving through each time. So we're now on sequence number 4. Now we're on sequence number 5. 6. So what I've really created here is a 256 step sequence. There's the last step, and now we'll go back to number 1. And so that's how you create a song. And when you save out this in VCV Rack, all the information is stored for that song. So you can just load it back in again. Now, that alone would be great. But Mark did something really, really great. You remember those modes that I showed you earlier for the random playback of sequences? So you could play back forwards, backwards, ping pong, Brownian, the drunken walk, and random. Well, the same modes apply to song mode. So now you can play the song as I did, going forward, or you could play the song backwards, or you could play the whole song going forward one time and then backwards one time. Or you can use the Brownian mode, which is when the drunken mode, basically, one step forward, one step back, maybe stay the same, maybe 2 steps forward, maybe 1 step back, maybe stay the same for a while. And when you do that with a sequence that's each step is slightly different to the one before, it becomes this very interesting, extremely long, because it becomes more than 256 steps, sequence that's constantly changing and evolving. And it sounds something like this. I'm going to turn on the sequence again. And I'm just going to let it run from the beginning. So there's the first step of the sequence. Now I'm going to change the mode to Brownian. Now watch the sequence here. See, it went forward one pattern and it stayed the same. Now what's it going to do next time? It went back one. It went back another one. Now it's gone forward one. Now it stayed the same. Now it's gone forward one. And this gives a really interesting progressional flow to a sequence that literally extends even a 256-step sequence to be just continuously infinitely long and changing all the time based on the patterns that you created, these sequences. And of course you can also put it to full random, so it just plays any of the 16 at random like this. So that was pattern play mode. And to be honest with you, that was going to be the last video before I demonstrate the mega patch I've created purely using PS16s. But then I had this idea, and well, you know how I really love the Turing machine, and it's great. The only problem with it is that when you find one of those sequences that it self-generates and you really like, you use it, but then you've lost it because the next time you load the patch, that sequence has gone forever. Not anymore. Because the phrase sequencer has this write input and this CV input, which automatically takes whatever notes you send it and writes them into steps, then so long as the PS16 and the Turing machine are running at the same clock speed with the same gates, you can record the Turing machine into the phrase sequence and record entire sequences that are generated by the Turing machine. So what I've done here is I've set up a sort of complicated arrangement just for this demo, but fundamentally what I'm doing is I'm feeding the outputs from the Turing machine into the write and the CV inputs of the phrase sequencer. So the out from here is going into a quantizer, into the stack, so I can get the octave I wanted, and then from there it goes into, in this case, a flow. This is just allowing me to turn on and off both modules, so you can hear the original output from the Turing machine and the recorded output from the phase sequence. And I've got two voices set up here just so I can show you them both in action. So let's listen to what the Turing machine is currently generating. So that's the Turing machine's output. And if I rotate the knob to full lock, then that will lock a sequence that I might like. So there's the sequence. That's the one that I've locked. But now if I save this patch out and load it in again, this sequence will be lost. So in this case, I'm going to send the outputs to the phrase sequencer, and then when I press this button here, instead of listening to the Turing machine make the sound, you'll be listening to the recorded version in the PS16, like this. And there's the PS16, who's recorded that sequence for me. Now if I go to sequence number 2, so there's sequence number 2 with nothing in it, and again I trigger it back again, and I'll free this up. So now the Turing machine is playing again, and I'll find another one I like. That's okay. So I'm going to record that, press the button, and now sequence 2 will have those notes in it. So there's sequence 2 now playing from the phrase sequence. And I can go back to the one I recorded earlier. There's the first one. And there's the second one. I mean, really useful. And it's not great for everything for that sequence. You know, you've got to have equal gates on both. But as a way of recording the basic output from a Turing machine, if you find one of those great sort of sequences it can produce, and you want to just store that somewhere permanently, well, you've got the phrase sequence 16 to do it for you. And then you can delete all this and just use the phrase sequence to play back those ones that you really liked, and you can arrange them into a song and do whatever you like. And you can have multiples of these running at the same time. And this makes that a really useful functionality, which, as I said, I wasn't thinking about. It just came to me when I was playing with it. And I'm like, oh, wow, I could do this too. And so now this has become part of my workflow with the Turing machine, is when I find things I like, I feed them into the phrase sequence 16 and store them. And I've got 16 of those for every song that I do. And I love that functionality. So really cool. So that's basically the end of this part of my in-depth look at the phrase sequence 16. What's my opinions of it? It's pretty stunning. I mean, I've got to say, it, along with AS's Restep and the Turing machine for random stuff, they're probably going to be my 3 go-to sequences for the next, I don't know, however many months, because I'm having so much fun using all 3 of them in combinations or by themselves, wherever else. I literally have found that using all 3 in together or by themselves, I can generate any type of music that I would typically like to perform. And the ability to have song mode in this to give me up to 256 steps, or longer if I use the Brownian or random modes, or putting 2 of these together with a sequential switch, giving me up to 512 or 1024 or 2048 step sequences. Yeah, I mean, literally, you can go as far as you want by locking these together. It's extraordinary, and great work, Mark. I mean, all these new additions that you made to it, the probability stuff, the tie stepping, just makes it so easy to use. And, well, you know, it's just a really, really cool module. So thanks, Mark. So that brings us to the end of today's Talking Rackhead. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a great week. Actually 2 weeks, because it'll be 2 weeks from today that I'll be releasing the next one. I've no idea what the content's going to be for the next one. We'll just have to wait and see. So everybody have a safe 2 weeks, and I look forward to seeing you the next time. Now, what I'm going to do is play you out with a mega patch made entirely from the phrase sequence 16s, who are sequencing everything except, and I will admit this, I also use the 12 key module linked together to do something a little bit crazy, and that was to try and use my mouse to jam live over the top of the playing sequences. I don't know whether I was that successful or not. Hey, that's for you guys to determine. But I hope you enjoy the play out piece. I've used basically all the techniques that I've demonstrated today with the PS16. All those techniques, the random mode, the song mode, Brownian modes, the input from keyboards, even a couple of the sequences were recorded from the Turing machine, and they're all in this patch. So basically, this mega patch is a demonstration of as many of the PS16 features as I could do in one single patch. Have a great time. Hope you enjoy it. Got any questions? Please leave them in the comments below as always, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks. Bye.